Okay, so for next week, we're going to look at Matthew chapters 1 through 10, and that's going to bring us back to the Gospels. Matthew's the first book in the New Testament. And the Gospels, remember, are all of the stories about Jesus. It's an introduction to Jesus. There's 4 Gospels. Matthew is one of the synoptic Gospels. We call this synoptic along with Mark and Luke because synoptic means same eye. Matthew was written from the same perspective or with the same source as Mark and Luke. If you notice, later on we'll read Mark and Luke, but you're going to notice that there's a lot of stories that are repeated between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now, John, we've already read the Gospel of John. We started with that in our New Testament readings. And John was a little bit different than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But you'll notice that Matthew, Mark, Luke all have kind of the same perspective. Scholars believe that they're all written from the same sort of source. You know, a lot of that source has to do with the oral tradition of the early church and the early disciples. But here's what you should look for specifically in Matthew as you start reading it this next week. First of all, look for the good news about Jesus because that's what the Gospels are all about. All 4 of the Gospels talk about Jesus. It's all about Jesus and the good news that Jesus has come from God to save us by going to the cross, dying for our sins, and raising from the dead. So look for this, traces of this as you read this. Also look for the emphasis, specifically in Matthew, the emphasis on the kingdom of heaven. We're going to see that phrase come up over and over again, the kingdom of heaven, that Jesus has come to sort of establish this new kingdom. That I like to call it the kingdom upside down. It's got totally different values, totally different way of thinking because it's rooted in God's ways. And so Jesus talks a lot about the kingdom of heaven in Matthew's eyes. And the third thing is to specifically look for an emphasis on the teachings of Jesus. For example, chapters 5, 6, and 7 are what we call the Sermon on the Mount. So one of the famous sermons of Jesus, there's some really, really awesome stuff there. Pay specific attention to that as you read those chapters. And then also in chapter 10, Matthew shows that Jesus gives this sermon, he sends out his disciples and gives them a special sermon. Now, Matthew was one of those 12 disciples, so Matthew remembers that, and he writes about it in chapter 10. So make sure you look for those things as you read it, and then we'll see you next week to talk about it.